I have learned over decades of watching states rise and fall that regimes rarely collapse from a single blow. They fail when pressure exploits fractures that have been ignored, denied, or papered over with ideology. Iran today is defined by such fault lines. They are not new and they are not mysterious. They are structural, cumulative, and visible to anyone willing to look past slogans and listen to the data. The first fracture is an economic reality. Years of sanctions, mismanagement, and corruption have hollowed out Iran's economy. Inflation has become a constant, not a crisis, eroding wages and savings alike. Subsidies that once bought social peace can no longer keep pace with rising food and fuel prices. A young, educated population finds itself underemployed or unemployed, locked out of opportunity while watching elites tied to the Revolutionary Guard accumulate wealth through sanctioned black markets and state monopolies. This is not ideological dissent. It is material exhaustion. The second fracture is demographic and generational. More than half of Iran's population was born after the Iran-Iraq War. They did not experience the revolution, nor do they feel indebted to it. What they see instead is a clerical system that regulates how they dress, speak, and live while failing to provide dignity or security. When legitimacy no longer renews itself through consent, it must rely on coercion, and coercion is a finite resource. The third fracture is institutional. Power in Iran is fragmented by design, clerical authority, elected bodies, security services, and parallel economic empires, all competing beneath the supreme leader's shadow. In times of stability, this system balances itself. Under stress, it paralyzes decision-making and encourages repression as the default response. That repression, in turn, deepens the crisis it is meant to contain. From a strategist's perspective, this is the dangerous moment. When a state loses the ability to adapt honestly to internal reality, it begins to mistake control for strength. History teaches that this illusion does not last. When unrest finally breaks the surface in a system like Iran's, it does not arrive as a single organized revolution. It comes as a release of accumulated pressure, spontaneous and decentralized, driven less by ideology than by exhaustion. I have seen this pattern before in states that believe surveillance and force could substitute for legitimacy. The spark is often mundane, a price hike, a death in custody, a local injustice. What matters is not the spark, but the fuel already soaked into society. In Iran, protests spread not because of coordination from above, but because grievances were universally shared. Demonstrations erupted simultaneously in major cities and provincial towns, cutting across class, ethnicity, and age. This was strategically significant. Movements confined to elites or capitals can be isolated. Movements that emerge everywhere at once strain the security apparatus itself, forcing hard choices about where force is applied and where it is withheld. The slogans told their own story. They moved quickly beyond economics and reform, challenging the authority of clerical rule itself. From an intelligence perspective, this signaled a shift from protest to rebellion, not in the military sense, but in the psychological one. Once fear breaks, it does not easily return. Each night on the streets became a test of endurance between citizens with nothing left to lose and a state forced to show its hand. The regime responded as it has been trained to respond: arrests, intimidation, and selective violence. But repression is a blunt instrument. It can disperse crowds, but it cannot erase memory. Every detained student, every beaten worker, every funeral becomes a note of resistance. The more force is used, the more participants are created. What struck me most was the absence of a single leader. Western analysts often misread this as weakness. It is the opposite. Leaderless movements are harder to decapitate and harder to co-opt. They reflect a society no longer asking permission to dissent. At this stage, the strategic question is no longer whether unrest can be suppressed in the short term, but at what cost to the state's remaining cohesion. History is unforgiving on this point. When a state believes its survival is at stake, it falls back on the tools it knows best. In Iran, that toolbox has been refined over decades: information control, calibrated violence, and the deliberate blurring of law and fear. I have studied these methods not as abstractions, but as operational choices made by regimes that no longer trust their own people. They are designed not to restore legitimacy, but to buy time. The first move is silence. Internet throttling and nationwide blackouts are not about cybersecurity. They are about isolating communities from one another and severing the feedback loop between protest and perception. A crowd that cannot be seen is easier to disperse. A death that cannot be recorded is easier to deny. But in the modern era, these measures reveal weakness more than strength. They tell citizens that the state fears their voices more than foreign enemies. Then comes force. Security units deploy with live ammunition, not because it is tactically necessary, but because it is psychologically decisive. The message is simple. Dissent carries a price. Yet every shot fired narrows the regime's options. Violence creates martyrs, and martyrs create memory. I have watched governments convince themselves that a few hundred arrests or a few dozen funerals will restore order, only to discover that repression multiplies resistance faster than it suppresses it. What follows is institutionalized brutality, mass detentions, expedited trials, coerced confessions broadcast as theater. This is not justice. It is deterrence masquerading as law. But deterrence depends on credibility. When courts lose legitimacy and prisons overflow, fear begins to fracture along social and familial lines. The state becomes omnipresent, but not omnipotent. Strategically, this is the regime's trap. Relying exclusively on coercion signals that it has no political solution left. Security forces are asked to perform a task they cannot complete, enforcing obedience in a society that has withdrawn consent. Over time, this corrodes the loyalty of the very institutions meant to protect the state. History does not judge regimes by how hard they strike, but by what they fail to see while striking. Iran's leadership is responding to symptoms, not causes, and that distinction matters more than any show of force. I have spent enough time inside the machinery of American power to recognize a signal when it is sent and to understand when ambiguity is intentional. Under Donald Trump, U.S. policy toward Iran was never about diplomacy in the classical sense. It was about pressure calibrated to create uncertainty inside the adversary's decision loop. Sanctions were not merely punitive. They were strategic instruments designed to constrict the state's capacity to manage crisis while amplifying internal stress. The reimposition and expansion of sanctions targeted Iran's financial arteries, its energy exports, and its access to international markets. The stated aim was to alter behavior, but the operational effect was to narrow Tehran's margin for error. Every budget shortfall, every delayed salary, every fuel shortage fed back into the unrest on the streets. From a realist standpoint, this was not regime change by force, but erosion by design. Trump's rhetoric mattered as much as the sanctions themselves. Public warnings, maximalist language, and the refusal to provide reassurances were meant to keep Iran guessing. Would Washington intervene militarily if the regime lashed out? Would it stand aside if repression escalated? The absence of clear answers was itself the message. Strategic ambiguity can deter, but it can also destabilize, especially when a regime is already under internal strain. The threshold of force hovered in the background. Carrier deployments, regional military readiness, and public references to options on the table were signals to Iran's leadership that external pressure could compound internal collapse, but they were also signals to the Iranian population that the regime's actions were being watched. This is a dangerous balance. When populations believe outside powers are shaping their fate, legitimacy erodes further and nationalist backlash becomes possible. From where I sit, the lesson is not about Trump's personality or politics. It is about how external pressure interacts with internal decay. Sanctions and signals can accelerate fractures, but they cannot control outcomes. Once unleashed, internal dynamics follow their own logic. Power, when projected without a clear end state, creates momentum that cannot easily be stopped. Every conflict is fought on two battlefields. One is physical, measured in bodies, streets, and prisons. The other is cognitive, where narratives compete to define reality itself. I spent my career watching how governments manipulate this second battlefield, often with more confidence than competence. In Iran, propaganda has long been a substitute for accountability. Today, it is being stretched to its breaking point. The regime's narrative is predictable because it is reflexive. Protesters are cast as foreign agents, traitors, or mercenaries manipulated by Western intelligence services. This framing is not designed to convince the undecided. It is meant to reassure loyalists and justify repression. By externalizing dissent, the leadership absolves itself of responsibility. Economic failure becomes sabotage. Political illegitimacy becomes conspiracy. But propaganda that contradicts lived experience eventually collapses under its own weight. When a factory worker cannot afford bread, no televised confession will persuade him that his suffering is the work of a distant enemy. On the other side, Western counterpropaganda dresses itself in the language of liberation. Statements about freedom, human rights, and democratic destiny are broadcast with confidence, but rarely with restraint. I have watched this playbook before. It simplifies complex societies into moral cartoons and encourages the belief that history bends naturally toward outcomes favored by Washington. This is not a strategy, it is self-affirmation. The danger lies in the interaction of these narratives. Iranian state propaganda hardens the regime's base and legitimizes violence. Western messaging risks delegitimizing indigenous dissent by associating it with external agendas. In intelligence terms, this creates noise that obscures reality. Real movements do not need foreign authorship, and real grievances do not require translation. What matters strategically is not which narrative dominates international headlines, but which one aligns with facts on the ground. In Iran, the state is losing that contest domestically. People no longer measure truth by official statements, but by price tags, funerals, and empty promises. Once credibility is gone, propaganda becomes static, loud, constant, and ignored. History shows that regimes fall not when propaganda fails abroad, but when it fails at home. Iran is approaching that threshold. When a state reaches this stage, strategy narrows. Options that once existed on paper are foreclosed by time, mistrust, and accumulated blood. I have watched governments arrive at this crossroads convinced they still control events, when in reality, they are choosing only the manner in which control is lost. Iran now faces three paths, each shaped not by ideology, but by constraint. Collapse is the path of systemic failure. It is not sudden, and it is rarely cinematic. Institutions stop functioning in coordination, orders are issued, but unevenly obeyed. Security forces fragment along professional, economic, or familial lines. This outcome does not require a decisive uprising. It requires sustained pressure and the absence of a credible political release valve. From a military standpoint, collapse is dangerous because it produces uncertainty, not victory. Borders harden, weapons disperse, and violence becomes localized and unpredictable. Compromise is the least likely option, but the least costly. It would require the leadership to concede that legitimacy cannot be restored through force alone. Political prisoners would need to be released, coercive laws rolled back, and real power redistributed. The problem is not feasibility, but trust. Decades of repression have convinced much of the population that concessions are tactical pauses, not genuine reform. Once that belief sets in, compromise arrives too late to stabilize the system. Cataclysm is the path regimes choose when they believe survival justifies any price. This is total repression, expanded executions, prolonged blackouts, and the normalization of mass violence. Strategically, this may suppress unrest temporarily, but it transforms the state into an occupying force ruling its own society. The human cost is obvious, the strategic cost is often ignored. Economies collapse, talent flees, and security institutions become instruments of fear rather than defense. What ties these paths together is a single misjudgment, the belief that power is measured by the capacity to punish rather than the ability to adapt. Military realism teaches otherwise. Force can shape behavior, but it cannot manufacture consent. When leaders confuse endurance with strength, they choose cataclysm, thinking it will prevent collapse, only to accelerate it. Iran's future will be decided not by rhetoric or foreign pressure, but by whether those in power understand this distinction before the crossroads disappears behind them. I have learned that the future of a state is rarely decided in the streets alone. It is decided in the moment when power realizes that the old rules no longer apply, but continues to act as if they do. Iran has reached that moment. What we are witnessing now is not a passing crisis, but the breakdown of an equilibrium that held for decades through fear, ideology, and inertia. The unrest spreading across Iran is no longer episodic. It is persistent, geographically broad, and socially deep. Workers, students, shopkeepers, and professionals are driven by different grievances, but they are united by the same conclusion: the system no longer serves them. From a strategic standpoint, this matters more than numbers. A state can survive large protest. It struggles to survive when obedience itself becomes conditional. The regime's response has been to intensify repression, believing that exhaustion will do what legitimacy no longer can. This is a familiar calculation, and it is usually wrong. Prolonged coercion degrades institutions. Security forces trained to fight external enemies are redirected inward, asked to police their own society indefinitely. Over time, discipline erodes, morale fractures, and loyalty becomes transactional. This is not a collapse yet, but it is how collapse begins. Externally, pressure and rhetoric from abroad will continue, but they are not decisive. No foreign power can engineer Iran's future without imposing costs that would outweigh any strategic gain. The decisive variable remains internal, whether the state can adapt before repression consumes what remains of its authority. History shows that regimes which delay adjustment often confuse survival with victory, only to discover that endurance has hollowed them out. Iran's future will likely be uneven and unstable, shaped by negotiation in some places and violence in others. The transition, if it comes, will not be clean. Revolutions rarely are. What matters is that the illusion of permanence has been shattered. Once people stop believing a system is unchangeable, it never fully recovers that belief. As a soldier and analyst, I do not predict outcomes. I measure trajectories. Iran's trajectory now points away from managed control and toward transformation. Whether that transformation is guided or chaotic will depend on choices made under pressure and on whether truth is acknowledged before force becomes the only language left.